his house is gone. The bedroom furniture is there, but he's in a glade surrounded by forest. He immediately gets up to investigate the chest. He's sure the enchantment has something to do with that fairy, and just behind the chest, there's a little rivulet of water that's opened up. And he begins to follow the rivulet till it turns into a brook, and then it turns into a stream, and then it turns into a river. And now Anados, the man without a way in this pilgrim world, finds a path, and he follows the river where it leads. Chapter 12, he comes to this house, this grand house. MacDonald would often use grand houses in his books, but we find in The Voyage of the Dawn Treader, Lewis is somewhat borrowing from this book when Lucy has to go to the magician's house on the Island of the Voices. This grand house in MacDonald is a house that is very inviting, but there's no sign of anybody there. At least he never meets anybody, but there's the sign of welcome and inhabitant. He goes into the house, and he finds every morning there's breakfast on a table for him. There's lunch at noon, there's a dinner at night. If he goes into the library, there's a fire in the grate. But he never meets anybody in this house. MacDonald would use this concept that we live in this wide, wide world, like a grand house, and it too is owned by somebody. Though we may not meet him in the flesh, he is constantly meeting our needs in ways we often neglect to offer thanks for. But Anados comes to the library, and in the library he finds many books, stories the likes of which he's never heard before. And one of the stories is the story of Cosmo. It's chapter 13 in that book. If you want to pick up the book and just read this particular story, I would encourage you to do it. It's about 20 pages. It won't take you long. And I can't do justice to the telling of it, even if I embellish it my own way. It's set in Prague, about 17th century. And Cosmo is the big man on campus. He's an athlete, so what's the sport? He's a fencer. And he's the best fencer in the university. He has a very private side that he withholds from everybody else. He's embarrassed of his poverty. To make ends meet, he has to teach fencing, and he usually teaches the wealthy students at the school. And though he's well liked and held in honor by his friends, when he leaves campus, he will never let them follow him, because he has to live at the far end, the outskirts of Prague, where the rents are cheaper. And he's embarrassed for people to see his life. And so that's why he makes ends meet, teaching fencing, going back and forth to university, and living this life of somewhat sorrow. One day when he's walking home, he walks into an antique store, and there's a sinister-looking proprietor at the door. He goes past him, and he goes into the store, and he sees a mirror that he really likes. It's not so much the reflection in the mirror, or the quality of the mirror, but it's the carvings on the wood that surround it. And so he buys the mirror against his better judgment, because he could ill afford such expense. And he takes it home, and he puts it up on his wall in his one-room flat, about 3 staircases up. He puts the mirror up. And his room looks like a college guy's room. It's a mess. He's got a hanging skeleton there from an anatomy class he had taken. There's a taxidermied bird of prey that's hideous looking, and just clothes everywhere. It's just a mess. He puts the mirror up on the wall. He sits down at his table to eat a bowl of mush. 6 o'clock, the church bells chime, and all of a sudden he sees movement in the mirror. The most beautiful woman he's ever seen in his life is coming into his room. He turns around to look. Nobody's coming in the door, and he realizes, oh my word, it's an enchanted mirror. He rushes up to the mirror, and he sees this woman. And she is so sullen, so sad. He's overwhelmed by her sadness. And he watches her as she makes the round through her room. And she sees the skeleton, and she is horrified. She registers contempt towards this bird of prey and notices the mess and leaves the room. Cosmo wonders if she's coming back or not, and he stays sentry at the mirror all through that night. All through that next day. He doesn't go to school, doesn't take on his fencing students or anything. He stays sentry and stands by the mirror. The next night, 6 o'clock, church bells chime, and the woman enters the room again. Same thing, sullen face. She looks at the skeleton. She looks at the bird of prey, and she goes on out. He's overwhelmed. He's tired. He sleeps. He hopes that maybe she'll come by at 6 o'clock the next day, but he doesn't go to school the next day, and he stays sentry at the Mere nevertheless, and she comes in, same pattern. And finally, he thinks there must be a rhythm to this every day at 6 o'clock, and he thinks, I have to somehow communicate with her after this has been going on for several days. So he thinks, one thing I can do, she registers contempt towards the skeleton and the bird of prey. He gets rid of those. He cleans up his rooms, look better than it's looked in ages. And she comes in the next night, 6 o'clock, when the church bells chime, and she notices, and a faint smile, a Mona Lisa-like smile, draws across her face. And he says, I can communicate with her. The next day he goes out and he buys a painting, and he brings it back and he puts it on the wall in a prominent space where surely she will be prone to see it. She comes in that next night, and she goes immediately to the painting, and a big grin comes across her face. And he's smitten. And each day he stays in his room. He doesn't go to school. He doesn't take on his students. And he goes out only briefly to buy things for the wall. After time, he feels he must have her. He goes to an occult bookstore and he buys a book of spells. And he seeks to work out a spell that he might actually bring her to his room. And sure enough, that night, there is howling wind. A raging storm as the lightning flashes and the thunder cracks. He lays the last bit of hair in the fire of the spell. And the door bangs open. And the woman is standing there, shrouded in a dark cloak. And the rain and wind comes in through the door, and she calls him by name, Cosmo, Cosmo. I am under a spell to the mirror. If you really love me, you will break the mirror. And he wonders if he'll see her again if he breaks the mirror. But he has no moment, but hesitates. And there's a flash of lightning and a crack of thunder. And the next thing he knows, it's the next morning. And he's waking up on the floor of his apartment, and the mirror is gone. His health is broken, but his quest has been defined. He nurses himself back to health. He goes back to the proprietor of that store. Sure enough, the mirror has been returned to the store, but it's been sold to a young person not unlike Cosmo himself. And so Cosmo starts following up every lead. He goes back to the university. He starts teaching fencing once again. Is that me? Is that okay? Should we just switch to this one?
Yeah.
All right. Man, I don't know what I did wrong. It must have been. If you get feedback, it must be something you ate. Anyway, so he finally, following every lead, finds that there's one young man that hasn't been showing up for fencing lessons, and so he starts asking about him, and they say, oh, he hasn't been on campus for weeks. He stays in his room all the time. The only time he comes to campus is to go outside. The only time he leaves his room is to go out and buy some painting for the wall or something. And the scene switches at that moment as Cosmo goes running on. And it's in the palace of the king. And in the chamber of the princess. And she's tossing and turning on her bed. And another storm is raging outside. And the chambermaids are saying, do you remember last time we had that horrible storm when she just put on her cloak and went out into the storm and came back hours later sopping wet? And just at that moment, the princess sits up in her bed and she says, Cosmo, Cosmo, then you really love me. And she puts on her cloak and goes running out into the storm, runs down from the palace up by St. Vitus Cathedral, down the hill, across the Charles Bridge, over the Moldau. She comes to the Charles University, and she sees Cosmo standing there, leaning up against a wall, and she runs up to him. He's sheepish white, but she says, Cosmo, Cosmo, then you really love me. And holding his side, he slips down the wall, and the blood trickles from between his fingers. And the story ended there. And Lewis said his imagination was baptized. What was the story? The Somebody who loved enough to give his life to make it count. Cosmo goes to break the mirror. The other man goes to protect the mirror. Cosmo taught him defense. And Cosmo loses his life to set the woman free. Lewis knew the value of story. The word definition means of the finite. We define things by their limitation and their function. They have to be small enough to wrap words around them in order to distinguish them from other things. But how do you define God, and how do you define the things of God? God is infinite. He breaks the category. And Lewis understood, as Jesus did when he described the kingdom of heaven and said the kingdom of heaven is like. He used simile, he uses metaphor, he uses figures of speech, he uses parables, he uses story. And Lewis uses story that we might grasp what spiritual maturity looks like. And so he tells the Narnia Chronicles. And particularly this evening, the Voyage of the Dawn Treader. To contextualize it, Caspian has been established as king of Narnia. And he is on a quest to find out what happened to the 7 lost lords of Narnia, who were sent out loyal to his father, but Miraz, the usurper, had sent them out basically to get rid of them. And they never returned. And Caspian feels like he owes the debt to these men who had been loyal to his true father. On board the ship is Ripachi, that valiant, most valiant of mice, who had a prophecy uttered over him when he was a child, that one day he would go to the eastern sea where the salt water turns sweet, and he would discover Aslan, and he has lived under that longing and that prophecy all of his life. The book begins, there once was a boy named Eustace Clarence Scrubb, and he almost deserved it. And that's written by Clive Staples Lewis, who knew nobody deserved it. And Eustace is, he's a brat. He's the archetypal brat. He has a heart of a dragon under the skin of a boy. And he ends up magically in Narnia with his cousins, Edmund and Lucy. And we remember them from The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. Edmund, who had betrayed his siblings, and yet was redeemed by Aslan, giving his life for Edmund. And Edmund became Edmund the Just, and tender, and good, and eager to live faithfully in light of the great price that was paid to redeem him. So Lucy and Edmund and Eustace end up, through a picture, in Narnia, and they're rescued by the Dawn Treader, and they hear about the whole voyage. And as I mentioned, Eustace was difficult from the get-go. But they come to an island. And it's been after a bad storm. The mast has been destroyed on the Dawn Treader. The ship is in desperate need of repair. It needs to be revictualled. They need more water for the hold, and so on. And so everybody's been given a job to do. But Eustace, who's trouble from the get-go, he wanders off lazy. And while he wanders off, he comes to a dragon's lair. He doesn't really know much about dragons because, as Lewis said, he never read the right books. And he sees this dragon die in front of him. He goes into the treasure and he puts on a band on his arm. And then as he goes into the cave of the dragon, he falls asleep. And when he awakens, he thinks, oh, I better get back to the ship. He goes to get a drink of water, and he looks in the water and he sees, hovering over him, a dragon. He goes, oh my heavens. He moves his left arm to escape, and the dragon moves his arm. He moves his right arm to escape, and the dragon moves his arm. And all of a sudden, Eustace gets the picture. He has become dragon. Magically, in that world, he has become externally what he's always been, and he sees it reflected in the pond. It's a motif that Lewis often uses. If you go back to Dymer, his first narrative poem that he published before he was a Christian. Dymer has all these trumped up airs about himself, and then he looks in the mirror and he sees how really weak he is. Or Rule, Queen of Globe, Until We Have Faces. Everything she hates, she looks in a pond and she discovers she is. Lewis himself in The Great Divorce finds himself on this bus filled with these hideous people who are coming up from hell to the threshold of heaven. Fights break out constantly on the bus, and when they break out on the bus,